Be ours a religion that, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Be the change you want to see in the world. Learn how to love. Last week, taking a dive into the deep roots of our Unitarian Universalist heritage, I made the point that we UUs practice a heretical faith, a faith based on personal choice and commitment. We claim that heritage of heresy, the power to search and identify the truth and meaning that most deeply resonates for us, as fundamental to living a life of faith and commitment, bringing light wherever we can. That is our fourth principle, at the center of the 7 principles that were first crafted when the Unitarians and Universalists came together to create the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations in 1961. Those principles are systematically reconsidered, revised, and affirmed by our congregations at least every 15 years, so they have been reconsidered and revised over the years, using a democratic process that's affirmed in our 5th principle, so that we are democratic and we are freely and responsible, open to change as we respond to the needs of the world. Those 7 principles comprise Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. They are official, they are filed with the government, and you can find them printed on the back border of your order of service as well as in the front of the blue hymnal. You don't need to memorize them, but we do our best to live by them. Then in 2017, I never printed out on 2 pages, 2-sided. So let me go ahead and pick up the paragraph I missed, because then it made no sense in the transition. It's consistent with our Unitarian, it's 6 paper, it's good. It's consistent with our Unitarian Universalist faith that we are united and guided in our faith not by a doctrine or creed defined by an external source of authority, but by a set of principles in which we claim the power of choice for ourselves, balancing freedom and responsibility in the search. So a bit of background on the proposed 8th principle taken from the Q&A that was shared through Newsgram this week and will be available at the Lunch and Learn after the service. As the story goes, in 1992, delegates from the congregations voting in our annual UUA General Assembly, that's our big annual meeting, passed a resolution that affirmed the, quote, vision of a racially diverse and multicultural Unitarian Universalism. Then 5 years later, in 1997, the General Assembly voted that the UUA commit to intentionally becoming a multicultural and anti-racist institution. Then in 2017, another 20 years later, that year's delegates passed a resolution empowering a study commission to continue adding an 8th principle to the UUA's bylaws. This initiative, evolving over the past 3 decades in our democratic system, has not been taken lightly. The proposed wording of the additional principle, which will join the other 7 if it is affirmed by congregations and passed by the Assembly, is that we promote and affirm journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. That reminds me of the work that Greta did this morning, all those things that were tangled up. These words challenge us to spiritual growth and call us to accountable action in a changing world. Last month, I preached about the heritage of white supremacy and racism, which are among the foundational principles of this nation. You can find that sermon on our church website under Sunday services. Historian Jill Lepore notes that from the earliest days of European settlement on this continent, slavery, which she calls the right of one human to own another, impossible to conceive in a state of nature or under a civil government, was not only possible, but lawful in America. The only way to justify this contradiction would be to create a new ideology of race. That new ideology would take a long time to grow and longer to wither, and it persists in our culture to this day. As I said last month, all men, not women, are created equal. That it says in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal except for those who do not fit a white European standard. The Constitution and laws of this nation were designed to allow the slaughter and enslavement of the indigenous people of this land, of those captured in Africa and sold to work as slaves, those from Mexico, China, Japan, and other nations, as well as the descendants of those people. Rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are too often restricted to a specific few, with males of Northern European descent at the top of the hierarchy, all others somewhere below on the scale. Sadly, those are the actual well-documented truths on which this nation is founded. That is what Paula was talking about as she invited Greta to turn around and face the tangle that we have created. But don't we know better now? Have things not changed since the 15th century when Europeans began to journey across the oceans to settle this continent? Yes and no. There has been change, there has been progress, and that progress has often been challenged and eroded by the racist ideology that was created to support the systems of the past and that persists in our culture and coded in practice and laws. We have seen an abolition movement, an emancipation of slaves, followed by the imposition of racist Jim Crow laws and practices. Steps forward, steps back. Treaties with indigenous tribes have been made, and they have been broken. Following creative and beneficial legislation for civil rights, voting rights, and school desegregation, state and local governments have been creative in placing barriers to equality in so many ways, using laws that disproportionately affect minority groups, systems of funding that use taxation from those who are most oppressed, targeted enforcement of laws, imprisonment and the use of violence, intrusive policies including stop and frisk, gerrymandering voting districts to effectively disenfranchise minority citizens. The list goes on and on. If you've been paying attention, you know all this. But there is so much to pay attention to in these times that sometimes we do not put the picture together. Those who suffer oppression are well aware of the reality of these systems of inequality and are astounded, even devastated, when people of privilege are surprised to learn about the deeply rooted injustices others face every day. Privilege, even for the most well-meaning among us, can have the effect of creating a sort of selective and protective blindness in which we are beguiled by a belief that our own personal experience is universal. I'm not stopped and frisked. I'm not randomly stopped for minor traffic offenses and then ending up in jail and 2 days later ending up dead. It just doesn't happen to me because of the color of my skin, the shape of my eyes. I will own that since I was raised in a cocoon of privilege, and this has been a learning journey for me, moving away from that beguiling belief that my own experience is universal. Privilege leads us to minimize or overlook the clear differences in how people of color are treated by law enforcement officers, by the courts, in employment, housing, healthcare. The areas of inequality are wide and deep. For instance, as one author writes, the Justice Department projects that 1 in 3 Black males born in the 21st century is expected to go to jail or prison at some point during his lifetime. So think about it. If you are African American and you have 3 sons, 1 in 3 of them will end up in jail, sometimes for something that other people wouldn't even be jailed for. The author continues, only in a country where we have learned to tolerate evidence of racial injustice would this be seen as something other than a national crisis. From the security of a position of privilege, it's easy to imagine that things are not really as bad, as unjust as some say they are. And yes, they really are that bad. The prospect of losing privilege and fear of change are driving much of the reactivity we see in society today. Theologian activist Jim Wallis, in his book, America's Original Sin, tells of speaking with his son's class several years ago on the topic of immigration. Quote, I told the students about our current problem of 11 million undocumented people living in uncertainty and fear for years and even decades, hardworking people facing exploitation, family separation, deportation. Looking very surprised, these students asked, why don't we fix that? Why doesn't Congress change the system? I answered, they say they're afraid. The students looked even more confused and asked, what are they afraid of? I paused to answer their honest question and looked around the room, a public school 5th grade class in Washington, D.C. I looked at their quizzical and concerned faces, a group of African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and European American children. Then it hit me. They are afraid of you, I replied. Why would they be afraid of us? The shocked students asked, totally perplexed. I had to tell them, they are afraid you are the future of America. They're afraid their country will someday look like this class and that you represent what our nation is becoming. End quote. In the current political and social environment of fear, the reach of racist, white supremacist thought is gaining in prominence and reach. The Anti-Defamation League last week issued a report on the rapid increase in white supremacy propaganda over recent years, with a doubling of reported incidents last year. The state of New Jersey has the 5th highest incidence in the nation. It's good to be a leader. It's not good that we are a leader in incidents of white supremacist propaganda. The report notes that, quote, the propaganda features veiled white supremacist language with a patriotic slant in an attempt to normalize the white supremacist message and bolster recruitment efforts. The effect of this hate-filled propaganda is to create fear and anxiety in communities, to reach and maybe radicalize individuals, and it is the starting point of a broader white supremacist movement's efforts. Racism and white supremacy are certainly not the only source of oppression in our society. There are many supremacies and isms, not only racism, but homophobia, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, nationalism, and other groups oppressed in the dominant society. So, as I have been asked, is it right that the proposed 8th principle specifically names racism and refers to all the others simply under the general term, and other oppressions? Those among us are oppressed on the grounds of their gender, of their identity, of their national origin, of their disability. Shouldn't a new UU principle address all of those oppressions? Shouldn't we include all of us? And my response is yes. The language is designed to include all types and sources of oppression, and I hope that we together can chart a course that continues to address all oppressions in our society, even as we sustain the potency of our focus on racial justice. To quote again from Jim Wallis's book, America's Original Sin, quote, racism is America's original sin and must be named as such. Sometimes it expresses itself explicitly and overtly, but racism lingers far more pervasively in implicit and covert ways in American institutions and cultures, in often unconscious attitudes, in the very structures of our society. This country made progress dismantling the most obvious forms of racial bigotry in the 1960s, but we refused to commit ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation. Consequently, new forms of racial subordination have emerged. Wallace calls upon Americans, especially communities of faith, to recognize the deeply rooted and damaging nature of this part of our national heritage, to turn and face it, so that we can move forward together. Our faith community can, and I think must, be in the vanguard of this fundamental work to restore wholeness in American society. Truth and reconciliation, restorative justice, reparation for millions of people in this nation descended from enslaved African Americans. Where would we even begin? What can these terms mean in the face of 4 centuries of oppression, slavery, and economic discrimination, systemic discrimination that has been built into laws and the implementation of those laws? A January article in the Washington Post called "Slavery Reparations, the Single Most Divisive Idea in American Politics." And yet, the only way to begin, I think, is actually to begin, seeking ways to restore wholeness and to undo the systems that have so deeply hurt generation after generation of our citizens. And it is happening. An example, in 2015, Chicago enacted a reparations ordinance covering hundreds of African Americans tortured by police from the 1970s to the 1990s, calling for financial compensation, a public memorial, and a range of assistance related to health, education, and emotional well-being. And it's happening here, as last November, the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus introduced legislation to establish a reparations task force to investigate the lingering effects of slavery, from racial wealth disparities to mass incarceration, and identifying actions to make sure that African Americans are made whole. This is our work to engage here and now, and we have deep thought and conversation ahead of us in this journey. The choir opened our service today with a call to open our hearts and wake our minds that we may be shown how to love. And then they echoed Mahatma Gandhi's call that we be the change, be the voice, be the light that we want to shine in the world. These are powerful calls for us to live into the deepest meaning of our chosen faith. And so I ask, what does it mean to consider adding a new principle to our faith statement, our statement of core values, to join the other statements of human worth and dignity, justice, equity, and compassion, democratic process, the interdependent web of all existence, to join these fundamental statements of our UU presence in the world? The 8th principle calls on us to work together to build meaningful relationships, to promote a diverse, multicultural community by dismantling racism in ourselves and in our institutions. What might our affirmation of that principle of faith look like right here at UUCCH? We will, and we commit to continue to learn and to work beyond our walls. We will utilize the principle as a lens to view all our activity and to thoughtfully consider how we conduct ourselves as a faith community. This will be an ongoing process of discernment and growth for our denomination, our congregation, and for each person. I treasure the fact that as a religious movement, we remain open to our evolution as a justice-seeking people in a complex social environment. We are called now to acknowledge that our human ways of being have created harm and continue to create grievous harm to many among us, and we seek ways to engage new understandings, even when they are difficult or painful, and to desist from and repair the harm. We affirm the value of diversity as a core element of our faith, but that does not mean there's anything easy about living in a diverse world. This is hard work, work that will extend far beyond our current human generations. And so we call upon our heritage of heresy, this chosen faith that leans in for justice, to find the place where our hunger and our passion meet, to call us forward, to call us on our way. And so may our promise find fulfillment and our future continue to unfold in love. Amen, and blessed be. I invite you now